Hello again. In this video, we'll go over the process of fuel tuning your Sea-Doo watercraft. If you've installed a larger supercharger or a performance camshaft in your Sea-Doo, you will need to tune your fuel system. That's where this video tutorial comes in. I'll explain which tables you'll have to adjust and what they actually do. Remember, tuning is not magic. It's just a skill like any other which you can learn. This tutorial is for the Bosch ME17 ECU, which is used on the Sea-Doo 300, 260, 230, and some 255 and 215 models. I'm assuming you have a wideband installed with an O2 sensor and you're able to data log your ski. You must have an O2 sensor to tune your ski. It's not an option. Also, the stock limiters have been removed, which I explained in a previous video. Okay, if you look through the HP Tuner's editing software, it may seem a bit overwhelming at first. There's a lot of possible settings. Don't worry, you will never touch the vast majority of those, and to tune fueling, you'll just be working with a couple tables most of the time. The one table where most of the work will take place is called the VE table, which stands for volumetric efficiency. Sometimes people refer to it as the fuel table, which is okay, although technically that's not accurate. Let's have a look at this table. It's located under the engine section and then the airflow subsection. As you can see here, there are two VE table variants. Only one will apply to your machine. You could figure out which one it is by trial and error, but the simplest thing to do is just to copy the settings to both. Now, you may wonder, if we're tuning fuel, why aren't we under the fuel subsection? Well, an engine is just an air pump. The more air it can process, the more power it will make. This is where volumetric efficiency table comes in. It tells the ECU how much air the engine is processing at any given RPM point and manifold pressure. The cells in the VE table are the efficiency percentages. When you change a cell value, you are not directly changing how much fuel the injectors supply. You are just telling the ECU how much air there is in the combustion chamber at a given RPM manifold pressure point. And in turn, the ECU does calculations based on the numbers you've provided and other sensor data to supply just the right amount of fuel. Most of your work will be spent in this table. The second table you may or may not end up modifying is the injector pulse correction table. This is actually a fuel table, so it's located under the fuel subsection and then the general tab. Let's open that up and have a look. The injector pulse width is how long in milliseconds the injector will be open and spraying fuel. When the ECU does its calculations based on the V table and other sensor data, it comes up with a number of how long the fuel injector will be open to supply the correct amount of fuel. This pulse correction table is an adjustment you yourself can force on that number. The way the values from this table are used is when the ECU calculates a pulse width and then checks this table to see if it needs to apply a correction to the number it came up with. Let's say the ECU calculated 3 ms as the injector pulse width, and it's currently at 6,000 RPM. If we check that cell, we see that it's currently at 1. This means there will be no adjustment. The correction table is a multiplier, meaning whatever injector pulse width the ECU came up with will be multiplied by whatever value is found in this table. So any cell where the number is below 1 will reduce the pulse width and fuel, and any number higher than 1 will add to the pulse width and more fuel. If you want to increase fuel by, say, 10%, you would enter 1.1 in a cell. Instead, let's say you want to remove 5%, you would enter 0.95, which would multiply the 3 ms by 0.95, giving a final pulse width of 2.85. You'll be able to see what the ECU is using as pulse width in your logged data. It's possible you may never actually even use this table, although it can be very handy. Sometimes it's almost impossible to get the fueling exactly where you want it using the V table alone for a specific RPM point and pressure. Using the corrections table, you can make more granular adjustments in places where you just can't get to with the VE table alone. There's one more table or set of tables you should understand. These are the last tables I will introduce, but they're actually the very first tables you should adjust. It's the lambda or AFR target tables. These tables are located under Fuel Power Enrichment subsection. Let's have a look. Okay, so we have two sets of tables here. One is called the minimum enrichment table, and one is the NOC enrichment. They both serve the same purpose, which is to give the ECU fueling targets to follow, but they are triggered under different conditions. These tables are not really used for tuning. They are more of a guide for the ECU. When you modify your VE table and then log, you want the logged data results to match the values in this table as close as possible. The reason for this is once your VE table is tuned to match these target tables, you can then change a target value and the ECU will adjust fueling so that real-world AFR will match the target value you entered automatically, which is pretty neat. Let's open the minimum enrichment table and see what it looks like. This table will be used throughout the RPM range under normal conditions. By default, the tables use lambda units, but if you prefer working with AFR, you can easily switch to those units instead. What you see here are the targets the ECU is aiming for when it does its fueling calculations. When the VE table is tuned correctly to follow these targets, you can then easily change AFR to wherever you want just by typing that number here. If we look at these two cells, at 1800 RPM, this is where the engine will idle at approximately. You'll be able to see the actual engine load numbers in your logs. It's very helpful when adjusting tables, like in this case. Let's say you want to idle at 14.2 instead. You would simply enter 14.2 in those two cells and magically the ECU will adjust fueling so that the real-world idle AFR ends up 14.2. This is why you should set up these target tables first before doing any fuel tuning. You want to follow the targets here while doing your VE adjustments. Now, I realize adding this table as the first thing you do may be a little tricky. Engine RPM is simple enough, but what the heck is engine load? Well, you will see engine load in your logs, but to help you get going and do the initial setup, here's what the engine load will look like approximately under smooth acceleration and without sharp turns at higher RPM, which increases load on the engine. The line shown will be about where you can expect the engine load to be at the RPM points indicated. The NOC enrichment table is very similar in that it has fueling targets as well, but this table is triggered when the ECU detects NOC. When the ECU detects NOC, it will switch to target this table in an attempt to cool down the combustion chamber. The values in this table should always be lower, meaning richer, than the minimum enrichment table. From my experience, the NOC detection which triggers this table is very sensitive. It's quite common to see the target from this table in the logs at higher RPM, even when there should be no NOC really. So just keep that in mind when looking at the target lambda in the logs. Understand that these tables are the targets for your actual tuning, which will mainly take place in the VE table. Although possible, do not use these tables as a workaround to fix incorrectly tuned VE table. That's just asking for trouble. When you're adjusting your VE table and your wideband reports the same number as the targets here, you have correctly tuned that RPM pressure point. Okay, now that we've had a quick intro to the tables we'll be working with, let's go back to the VE table and do some actual tuning. Before we start making adjustments, there's one more important thing I want to mention. If you're adding power adders to your CDU, you will most likely run at a higher RPM than stock. If you're aiming to run, let's say 8900 RPM, it doesn't make much sense to be setting your wide open throttle numbers at 8500 RPM like you see in this table. HP Tuners allows you to change the X and Y axis numbers to better suit your situation. To change the RPM column numbers, right-click anywhere on the table, go to Column Axis and Edit. In the new window that opens, simply click on the RPM number you wish to change and start typing. When you're done, hit Enter and close the window. The VE table will update with the changes you requested. Keep in mind that you are limited to a fixed number of columns, so you may need to adjust a couple to keep them from having too large of a difference. In this example, for instance, I would also change the 8200 RPM column to 8400 to reduce the jump to 8900. Any changes you make will also need to be done to other variants as well. Okay, enough with all the intro stuff. Let's see how actual fuel tuning is done. We'll open an example log of a CDU 300 and see what it looks like. Okay, so this is a log I did a while ago. On the left side, you see all the data channels that were logged during that session. I would recommend logging as many channels as you can. You can actually pick which ones HP Tuners logs, but the more you have, the better. Some of the important data points here. So you have your RPM, you have your lambda. This is your wideband data, right? I'm assuming you have your wideband installed and it's working correctly. The desired lambda, that's actually coming from those lambda target tables I explained earlier. So on this graph, where you see the green line here, this is your actual lambda being logged from the wideband. The white line are your targets from those target tables. So your goal is to make those two lines perfectly even. It's not always possible, but as long as you get pretty close to it, you're good. So in this example, it's pretty good in this section, but if it was me, I would revisit this location here. Because right here you can see that your desired targets are actually a bit leaner, right? You're actually having a bit too much fuel in this section. It depends how picky you are, right? Some people may just ignore a difference like this. I mean, if you look here, it's what? It's pretty close. So yeah, it depends how picky you are. Here's one more spot where we could make a small adjustment, but again, we're talking tiny variations versus your targets. Okay, so back to this list here. Manifold absolute pressure. This data is used in the VE table as the y-axis. So you take this and the RPM, which then allows you to target specific cells in the VE table, which you're adjusting based on the logged data. Engine load. This is also quite a useful channel to have logged. One of the target tables, the lambda target tables, uses engine load as the y-axis. So you can actually use this data to adjust that table. And let's say you want to show the engine load in your logged graph here. It's pretty simple. Just right click, change layout, and then pick which group you want to add, which is the third group, since we have the knock sensor data here. Now click Add Series and pick the parameter. You can click this option here, which will limit the parameters it searches to the ones you've logged. So click it and then search for engine load. And then just double click, name it. You can pick the color if you want a different one from the default. Let's say we'll go with this pinkish one. And close, and there you go. So now you have your engine load in the graph here, and you can see how it looks at different RPM points and boost levels. Okay, now injector pulse widths are also very useful. So you can use this data here to modify those injector pulse correction tables, which will help you with fine-tuning your fueling in spots where the VE table just doesn't get to. So yeah, very important and very useful data right here. So this tune is fairly close to being good. There are a couple spots where we can make adjustments. Now, when you do your logging first, your targets versus your actual lambda AFR will be way off, right? So you won't see that this line, the white line and the green line being so close, which is normal, right? Because you're just tuning your skew, just getting going. Now let's see how we can actually correct a couple spots in this tune, just to show you how things are done. So if we look here, this little section here at about 5600 RPM is a little bit rich, right? So our targets are about 13.6, but we're seeing about 13.3, which is a little bit, I mean, it doesn't hurt at this RPM point, but if it's me, I'll try to fix this, right? Make it a bit closer. So let's see what we can do. So yeah, it's about 5600 RPM and 92 or 93 kPa boost pressure, manifold pressure. So let's use the VE table to make an adjustment to get this a bit closer. Okay, so here is the VE table, and if we look for the 5600 RPM column, it's right here, and we're trying to edit the 92 or 93 kPa row, which we don't have exactly, which is normal. We have 95, which is pretty close. So if we go to the 95 cell, is this one right here. So this cell will be mostly responsible for fueling of this point right here. So we want to reduce the fuel amount by tiny bit. Don't make big adjustments. Make the smaller adjustments, the better, right? You may revisit that point later on, but don't make big jumps. So let's say we want to remove a little bit of fuel. You can press plus or minus on the keyboard and make small adjustments. But if you have a specific number in mind, so let's say we want to remove 1, you can just type -1 here and hit plus. So it's going to add -1 to this field. So now if you save this tune and write it to the ECU and then go for a log, this section should slightly change, right? So your actual lambda should be a bit higher, or the AFR should be a bit higher, closer to your targets. So this adjustment was fairly simple, since we had a pretty specific cell we could make the change in. Now, let's say, for example, the pressure was at 90 kPa. As you can see, there is no 90 kPa row. What the ECU will do is we'll take the 85 and 95 cells, these here, and blend them together to come up with the number, right? So in this instance, if we were adjusting for the 90 kPa pressure point, we'd have to make adjustments to both cells. So that's one of the reasons making small adjustments versus large adjustments is important. Because if you make a big adjustment, it may have undesirable effects on adjacent cells. So make small adjustments, go for a log, and see how your change affected the fueling in the spot you're targeting as well as the adjacent spots, because sometimes your change may have an effect that you didn't want on position either before or after in the RPM range where you're targeting. Let's make one more adjustment using the VE table. This 8200 range looks like a good candidate. So our target is about 12.6, but we're seeing low 12s. So we have too much fuel in this area here. So we're looking to adjust 80 to 100 RPM range at about 192 to 195 kPa. So here we have the 80 to 100 RPM column, but for pressure we don't have anything really that close to low 190s, right? So the closest one is 200, and this right here is the cell we'll make the adjustment in, which currently has 199.5. Now keep in mind that we're not exactly at 200 in the log, so this 180 cell will also have a very small effect or influence on that location in the log. So you could make a tiny adjustment to the 180 and bigger one to the 200, but for now I would just make an adjustment to the 200 and then do a log and see the results. So let's remove again 1% from this cell, which means you're reducing the efficiency, and in turn the ECU will remove fuel. So let's remove 1%. So there you go. We now removed 1%. So at this point I would save it, save the tune, write it to the ECU, and do a log and see how the changes we made affected the actual AFR. I mentioned earlier that you can also use the injector pulse correction tables to make fuel adjustments. So this is a good time to show you how to make this adjustment using that table instead of the VE table. Let's have a look. See that in this range, the actual injector pulse widths are about 8.4 ms. See, 8.4, 8.3. Okay, so now if we open the fuel and injector pulse multiplier table, now this table can be a little tricky to adjust if the cell you are targeting is not a 1, meaning it's been modified. That's because the pulse width data you see in the log would already have an adjustment applied and would not match up exactly to the row you may expect. So be careful when adjusting cells which are not a 1 and make very small changes. Sometimes it's better to adjust a few cells in the column together. It may take a bit of trial and error. Now locate the 80 to 100 RPM column, and for the row we're looking for the closest value to 8.3 to 8.4, which in this case is 8.5. So this here is the cell which the ECU will check to make any final adjustments to fueling for that range that we saw in the log. So if you make an edit to this cell here, you will also affect the fueling in that RPM range. So let's make that happen. Again, let's remove 1% of fuel from this cell. So there we go. We removed 1% of fuel. So now when the ECU reaches that RPM range and injector pulse width, it will come here, check this cell, and apply the correction. So this is another way which you can use to make adjustments to fueling instead of the VE table. But I would only use this table if you can't make things work using the VE table, which sometimes happens. As you can see, tuning fuel isn't magic. It just takes a bit of time and work, but you may actually find it enjoyable and rewarding at the end of the day. The most important part is getting a good data log and making small adjustments. Don't try to get things perfect on the first try. Usually, it takes several data logs and adjustments to get things just right. As far as logging goes, the number one rule in logging is you want small, steady RPM increments. You don't want to just chop on the throttle and just go wild, because all you'll get is garbage data which you cannot use. In this log, you can see that I'm slowly increasing the RPM. I'm actually trying to hold the RPM at those specific column values from the VE table. Like here you can see I'm trying to hold 3000. Here I'm trying to hold 3200. The next one is 3500. Right here, see, I try to hold it for a few seconds, which gives me a steady state result, meaning it's good data. The higher you go, here it's 3800. See, I'm holding it for several seconds to get good data logged. And I keep going up and up. This is how you should log. Maybe even take a piece of paper, write all those column values, and tape it to the steering bars so you can actually see the numbers you have to hit as you go up and up. I also strongly recommend having a way to see the actual AFR as you log, because you can get to a point where it's actually not safe to go any higher RPM, at which point you should stop, look at the log, make the adjustments to fueling, and start the log again. With that, we've come to the end of this Fueling 101 tutorial. Don't forget to visit our website at activejetsport.com for your performance parts and other HP tuners videos. Till next time.